Hi everybody, and welcome to this evening's CLMP training webinar. My name is Laura Kaminsky, and I am the Program Administrator for MiCorps, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Steen, MiCorps Program Manager. Before we get started, I would just like to take a moment, if I can flip my slide here, to show you how you'll be able to ask questions during our webinar this evening. So let me just walk you through this. First, you're going to want to locate your GoToWebinar toolbar. So you'll look for the orange arrow, which is probably in the upper right corner of your screen, and click on that to expand. Then you're going to want to click to expand the panes for audio and questions. Click on those little plus signs. So then we have two different ways to ask questions. To ask a question over the phone, you'll want to click on the hand in that toolbar to virtually raise your hand. At the end of the presentation, we'll let you know when your line has been unmuted to ask your question. Or if you prefer, you can submit questions at any time by typing them into the questions box, and we will respond to them at the end of each presentation. Okay, let's practice. Everyone, please either raise your hand or say hello to the group by typing something quick into the questions box. All right, I see a couple of hands. Lots of hands going up. Good, good, good. No questions yet. All right, looks like people are getting the hang of this. If you do run into any technical problems during the webinar, you can send me a message using that same questions box, or I will be keeping an eye on my email, laurak@glc.org, so just send me a message that way. And if at any time you get disconnected from the webinar or the audio, you can attempt to reconnect using your participant link. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Paul to get us started. Go ahead.
Well, just a little technical difficulty here, trying to get something to work.
Okay, let's try something. If you guys could hear Paul talking, could you please raise your hand?
Talking, 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 test, test.
Okay, good. They can hear you. So I think that red light means something else.
Okay, if I end up being too quiet because we're wondering about this mic, please someone type that I'm too quiet, otherwise I'll keep going. So thanks for joining us tonight. We are going to start with a training in how to take Secchi disc measurements and how to collect water samples for total phosphorus. We'll then go to the Score the Shore training and then wrap it up with the chlorophyll training. So that's our agenda for the night. And my name's Paul Steen. I work with the Huron River Watershed Council, which is a nonprofit in Ann Arbor, and we've been contracted through the DEQ to help run the CLMP program. So CLMP is really a joint effort with lots of organizations, and together we're able to run it and keep track of all the lake data across the state and to develop good relationships over time with all of our volunteers. So the program has actually existed for quite a few years. In 1974, it was first launched, but it was called the Self-Help Program back then. It was actually the second oldest program of its type in the country. And then since that time, it has been operating since 1974. But at first it was just Secchi disc, and since that time we've added other parameters. As the program has grown and there's been a demand for it, we have, we've added spring phosphorus. We now measure dissolved oxygen and temperature, plants. And just this past summer in 2016 is when the most recent parameter, Score the Shore, was officially added to the program. And the program has just seen tremendous growth over the years. This graph actually only goes back to 1998, but it tracks what lakes have completed the three, what I consider the three main parameters, the Secchi, total phosphorus, and the chlorophyll. And we've reached our peak last summer at 140 lakes completing all three of these parameters. And I believe 2017 is a little higher yet. So we're seeing another year of growth in the program, and just really exciting to see that the program is being embraced by people across the state who find it useful and important. There are two main goals to the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. Number one is education of you folks as the first line. We want to educate and build a constituency of citizens to practice sound lake management at the local level. And then through the combination of us all, we're building support at a state level in addition. And it doesn't end there. I like to think that the leaders of this program are training you, but then you go on to train the other people around you, your family members, your neighbors that live on the lake with you. We want you to take what you learned through this program and spread it, so we continue this education. And to do this, we have various fact sheets for each parameter that are all available on our website. You can use these to both educate yourself, but as well as to educate your neighbors about what you're measuring and why. If you want to make a presentation for your lake association or for your neighbors at some point, we actually have a way to get you going on that. So you can go to this website. This is our main website at MiCorps.net, and then go to lake monitoring, and then go to the CLMP documents tabs. That will bring you to a PowerPoint that you can use as a base, and then put in your own data and your own pictures to make it fit your lake. So we love it when we hear people doing this and talking to their own neighbors about the CLMP program. And actually, all of our documents are found here. So just as an aside, you can know that if you need procedures, if you need schedules, if you need blank data forms, this is the place to go to get all of those documents. So it's pretty easy to find once you go there, but as long as you remember MiCorps.net, you'll be set. Okay, going back to goals. Our second goal with the CLMP is to generate data. So this is both data that you will use in your management of your lake, and it's also data that the DEQ is able to use to increase their knowledge of lakes and to aid them in their statewide management. Now, one thing that's important to note is that this program is centered on monitoring, not management. We teach residents how to monitor their lakes. We are interested in management, but that is a scope that goes beyond what this project can offer. So when we get questions about management, we help how we can, but we usually end up passing you on to maybe a lake consultant or other members of the DEQ or the DNR. So we kind of see ourselves as a first step. The first step in management is to monitor and get data that tells you what's going on your lake, and then you figure out the steps after that in terms of management, and that's when it starts going beyond the program. So once again, we're able to give some advice and talk a little bit about that, but ultimately you would end up going to a different group of people to accomplish this management. Okay, I mentioned this already. So here's our website. Some other resources to be aware of on that website. We have a manual. It's a PDF of about 100 pages or so, And there's also a printed version that if you were to come to any of our in-person events, you could pick up. So that is the manual that goes over everything that we do in great detail. And we also have on our webpage quick reference procedures. These are just page or 2 pages perhaps of check boxes. So it gives you the very quick bare bones, what do I need to know to get this monitoring done and do it right. So it doesn't go through all the details, but it steps you through the important pieces to make sure you're doing it right. So anyway, be aware of that, especially for chlorophyll monitoring. I suggest you have that quick reference procedure with you and refer to it often, because there's a lot of steps for that one. Okay, so let's think more about the monitoring itself. What we monitor in this program are trophic state indicators. Trophic actually comes from the Greek trophos, which means food or nourishment. So what we are monitoring through this program are measurements that get at the level of the underlying food web on your lake. So what is the algae and how does that affect the life in your lake? Do you have a lot? Do you have a little? And then that's actually the first 3 parameters listed here address that very specifically, the level of food. And then the second, or the 4th and 5th here are the consequences. What are the consequences of having a very high nutrient lake with a lot of fish food in it that affects your dissolved oxygen and temperature in your aquatic plants? So altogether, these are considered to be trophic state indicators. Now for transparency, this is the simplest measurement that we do. We monitor this through this year. We monitor this through May 14 through May 16. We ask that participants try to make a measurement every week. And then, but the bare minimum, you have to get at least 8 measurements. This is very important, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. So this is the Secchi disc here. So I think it's an 8-inch disc. It was invented in 1865 by an Italian scientist, Angelo Secchi. Actually, the Secchi disc is often pronounced Secchi or Secchi, and I think it's really a matter of your preference. Probably the correct pronunciation is Secchi, and if anyone is Italian online and wants to correct me or tell me the proper pronunciation, that would be great. But I just call it Secchi out of habit, I think. So anyway, it used to be a completely white disc, and at some point in its history, they added the black quadrants in here just to give extra contrast and make it easier to see. So it's a very old piece of equipment, one of the first pieces developed for measuring water quality, and people still use it today, obviously. What does it do? Well, the more clear your lake is, the further down you can see, and this is just a simple graph that indicates this. And it can tell you the level of the turbidity, of the cloudiness of the water. Now, of course, the cloudiness of your water, of your lake, is affected by more than just algae. That's what we're going for in this program, is that we want to understand the algae. But there's things like suspended solids, clays, and silts that can affect your transparency. Lake color can affect your transparency. There's a thing called marl or calcium carbonate, which some lakes have a lot of, that can affect your transparency. Heavy boating certainly does because it's stirring up the sediment. So it's not a perfect measurement. We just want the algae. This is giving us a whole variety of things. So it's not a perfect measurement, but because it's an easy measurement to make and it's cheap, it's a good first measurement to make. It can at least give you a good baseline, a good sense of what's going on. Where do you monitor on your lake? When you enroll in the program, you should be given a 6-digit number with Jean Roth, who's our person who's in charge of registration. She'll work with you to make sure you have the 6-digit number. Each one of these 6-digit numbers is associated with a latitude, longitude. And that latitude, longitude will refer to the deepest part of your lake, and that is your sampling point. That's where all your measurements are made. If you're new and your lake doesn't have a latitude, longitude assigned to it yet, which happens sometimes, that is because we don't know what your deepest point is, and maybe because of incomplete maps. So when that is the case, we ask you to tell us what the deepest point is. You're out there with your depth finders and have a better sense than us. So if you haven't been told your lat long yet, then we're relying on you to determine it and get back to us, and then we'll be able to record it for long-term data storage and data use. Okay, so day of the monitoring, you're headed out to that deepest point that we just talked about. You'll want to, if it's a windy day, you'll certainly want to anchor in. You can anchor in and let out enough line so that there's slack and let the wind push you over that deep spot. If it's not a windy day, you can just cut the engine and coast in to that deep location, and then sit there for about 10 minutes or so and let all the water settle so that it is not stirred up by the activity of your boat. Then take out your Secchi disc and slowly lower it until it disappears from view. And your Secchi disc will be attached to a tape measure. So you'll be able to record that number that's on your tape measure right where it touches the water. You then want to raise the disc until you can see it again. And strangely enough, where it disappears in step 1 and where it reappears in step 2, they will be different numbers because it seems to how our eyes are able to track the disc. It ends up having 2 different numbers there. So you want to know what both of those numbers are, because what you're officially recording on your data sheet is the average of those 2 depths. Okay, so it's a pretty simple measurement. But here's some caveats. First of all, don't use sunglasses or anything that will interfere with the visibility, the amount of light reaching your eyes. So don't do what this fellow is doing here, and remember to take your sunglasses off. When you have the choice, pick the shadow of the boat. Once again, this is just so you have a standardized decision so that you're not going back and forth every week picking something different. How far you'll be able to see will be greatly affected by whether you're in the shadow of the boat or not. So we just say we always pick the shadow. If there is no shadow, then there's nothing you can do about it, and you just take the measurement. Depends on the time of day and what the conditions of the sun are. Number 3, be consistent in weather and timing. We ask that you take measurements sometime between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. And then pick something in that range and then stay with it. Try to always, if you pick 1 p.m., always try to take your measurements at 1 p.m. If you choose to do it in the middle of the week, then you should always try to take your measurements in the middle of the week. One thing you'll want to be careful on is weekend measurements. If there's a lot of boat activity, that will definitely affect your Secchi measurement. So you should, if you can at all help it, try not to take weekend measurements. So and pick calm days if possible, without a lot of boat traffic. So that's a lot of things to watch, but the important thing is that I think the consistency in the daylight is the most important thing. And then otherwise you just try to do the best you can to pick calm days. And then I alluded to this earlier. We want 8 measurements across the whole summer, and that's the absolute minimum. So you need those 8. And the reason for this is because the algae population, algae community in your lake does change over time. So in the spring, you'll tend to have more diatoms, and in the middle of the summer, you'll tend to have more green algae. And by the end of the summer, you'll have more blue-green algae, and each of these is going to affect your transparency in different ways. So we're not interested in knowing what your transparency is just for the month of May. We want to know all the way May through September, and that requires taking measurements across the entire summer. So if you take a measurement every week, you'll end up with 18 or 19 measurements. Which is the best thing to do. It gives the most clearest picture of what your transparency is. If that's too much for your schedule, try to take a measurement every other week. That will still give you enough measurements to meet that 8 measurement requirement. If you don't get 8 measurements, then we still take your data and we still put it into our long-term data set, but we don't calculate any of the statistics that go with it, and it ultimately doesn't get plotted on any trend graph. So it really is important to make sure you get that. This is what the data form looks like for Secchi Disk. There's some basic information on the top. You have to fill in your lake name, county, township, your sampling site or your field ID number. That's that 6-digit number that's assigned to your lake. Once again, that's just really important because that's kind of it's kind of like your social security number for your lake. It connects it to the database and just enables the long-term data storage. And then you'll see latitude, longitude, your name, and the different weeks in which you should be taking your measurements. So as long as you only do it once on each of these lines, you're great. You'll notice that Secchi depth is rounded to the nearest half foot. So just watch that when you take your measurement. You can round to the nearest half foot. You can include weather conditions. If your Secchi disk, if you have a shallow lake, or if you can just see really far down and your Secchi disk actually sits on the bottom of the lake, make sure you note that in your unusual conditions column. That definitely affects how we interpret the data. On the back of your data sheet, you will see this. There's a place to draw in the outline of your lake along with a little star that shows where you did your sample. Below that, there is something that asks you if you entered your data into the data exchange or not. And we'll talk about what the data exchange is. Basically, we want to know if you entered it or if you want us to enter it. If you don't enter the data yourself, our staff will have to do it. So we want to know what you did. And then no matter what you do, if you entered the data, didn't enter the data, we still ask for a copy of the data sheet. So make a copy and send it to Jean at the address on the bottom of the data sheet. We just like to have a paper copy for our long-term records. Okay, so what is the MiCorps Data Exchange? The MiCorps Data Exchange is our online database. Maybe you've seen it at www.micorps.net. It's publicly searchable for anyone who wants to go in and see the data that's been collected through this program. If you do choose to enter your data yourself, you get automatically registered into this data entry drawing where we give out a free registration for one randomly selected person who entered their data. We hope you do use a MiCorps data exchange, and to do so, you do need a username and a password. Let's see, the next slide next slide does not talk about that. So that last bullet then talks about it. So if you want to use the data exchange, email mydata@glc.org. In your email, say you want to log in and the password, and give your lake name and your county and that 6-digit number, and we'll hook you up with what you need to get into the data exchange. So here's how you find it. It's just a simple click in the corner on our website. I'm skipping a screen here, but it will ask you if you want to enter data or view data. So you pick what's appropriate. If you want to enter data, then you need to type in your username or password. And then it will pop up a list of all your site ID numbers that you have permission to enter data for. If you monitor a couple different lakes, it will list however many site ID numbers that you have permission to enter data for. And you click on that site ID number, and it says what parameter do you want to enter data for. In this case, I clicked Secchi, and then it's a simple matter of going through the drop-down boxes and entering your information. So it's a very easy process, and it's really no harder than buying something online. At the end of the field season, we collate all that data. We have to wait for results to come back from the lab from our phosphorus and chlorophyll. So it takes a little bit. By the early part of the next year, you get a data report that has graphs and data summaries, and that either gets emailed to you or mailed to you depending on what you picked during the registration. So here's just an example of the kind of graphs that you might see. Long-term, this particular lake they had been monitoring since the 70s, and they were able to see an increase of transparency over time. You'll notice with transparency graphs, the y-axis, the axis that runs vertically, it's flipped. The 0 is at the top and the high number is at the bottom, and that's just what we always do with Secchi graphs, because we try to make it look like you are on the surface and looking down into the water. So the lower those dots go, the more your transparency. Here's just an example of the benefit of using a long-term database. So we had, probably in the case here, we had one volunteer who worked on this program in the early 80s. Come 2000s, we had another volunteer registered the same lake, and and then suddenly you have a long-term data set that you wouldn't get if you were just doing this by yourself. So it's a very neat way to see how generations can connect through this program. Okay, so continue to write your questions, but I'm going to go right on to the phosphorus. And a lot of you probably have already done phosphorus already. We have 2 phosphorus measurements that are taken. There's one taken in the spring and there's one in the summer. And all the spring phosphorus has already taken place. So you've probably, if you've done that, you've seen the procedures, and you'll have this should seem very familiar. Okay, so if in the spring, if you registered, this is what you got in the mail. Now, if you registered for summer phosphorus, you actually are going to get a mailing in August. So sometime early August, you will also get this material in the mail. other things that you are going to need, you'll need a cooler bag and an ice pack. You'll need Ziploc baggies of different sizes, and you'll need a pencil or a Sharpie or some kind of writing utensil that will not run in water. If you use a normal ballpoint pen and your label will get wet, all that ink will run off and we won't be able to read it anymore. So be sure to use a pencil or a Sharpie. Spring Overturn sample is taken after ice out. This is after the lake is completely mixed. So the phosphorus is evenly mixed throughout the lake, and you just take a surface grab sample, and that, because it's evenly mixed, that sample is representative of the whole lake. In the summer, it's different. Many lakes stratify, which means they're forming separate layers, and the phosphorus you have at the surface will be different than the phosphorus you have at the bottom. And we are just grabbing the surface sample, and what that indicates is the amount of phosphorus available to the plants and the algae, which is typically going to grow in the top of a lake because that's where the light is. So in the summer, that's what you're getting for your total phosphorus measurement. You will have there's different turn-in dates based where you live in the state. And that's because different places in the state will experience the fall turnover at different times. So further up north, Upper Peninsula or northern Lower Peninsula of Michigan, we want to make sure that the phosphorus sample is taken before that turnover happens. So they end up sampling at the end of August or the beginning of September, while someone in southern Michigan is going to actually end up taking their sample closer to the end of September. So this schedule is very important to refer to, and you find your county and make sure that you're taking your sample at the right date. And then you also want to refer to that turn-in time and make sure you get your sample turned in at the right moment also. I think I'll talk more about the turn-in as we go on. This is what your labels will look like. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll point out a couple of things here. Analysis or parameter code, you want to write GA, which stands for General Analysis. And then you'll see in the other difference in these is in the second label, where it says location, you'll see it says REP, rep. So on your second label, you want to write rep, which just indicates that you're getting a replicate sample. So when you take your phosphorus samples, you actually fill up both bottles. One's considered your primary sample and one's considered your replicate sample. Okay, so you're out on the boat. You've gone to the same place that you take your Secchi measurements. You've let the water settle for that 10 minutes. And then it's time to get that surface water sample. So open up your caps. Now the caps have to stay on to the very last minute because these bottles have been, through the lab, they've been properly cleaned, so we know there's no phosphorus in the bottles. So keep them capped to the last second. Keep your fingers away from those ends by all means, because fingers can have a lot of phosphorus on them. So notice the person in this picture is actually holding this the very end of the bottle and not having his fingers anywhere close to that opening. So you get out there, rinse it twice with normal lake water. And then you want to hold the phosphorus bottle at its end, like I showed you, and then point that bottle straight down into the water. And once you've lowered it all the way to about your elbow or so, you can turn your hand over and then let the air out and the water will come in. This is because we don't want the very top bit of water, but we want to go down about a foot, just to avoid floaties and other things that might be on the very top surface of the water. So you do that twice. Remember, we're taking 2 bottles worth. Pour out a little bit of the water so once you freeze it, it doesn't crack the lid. If a lid gets cracked, we have to reject the sample. You put the labels on. You put it in a baggie that can just put both samples together. Label that baggie with date, with your lake, with your name, and put it in this cooler right away, because we want to slow down any biological activity that may happen, and to do that we need to just get it on ice. You can fill out your data sheet out here in the field. The data sheet is very simplistic. It's that same basic information, and then basically the date you took the sample and weather conditions, and the date of the sample turn-in, which depends on that schedule. So, which, by the way, you get on the website like everything else. So it's a simple data form. The back of the data form will look the same as a Secchi. Once again, it asks you, did you enter your information into the data exchange? So please do that if you can. In this case, you're not mailing your data sheet in, because you're going to actually be turning your phosphorus samples into an office, and you just turn in your data sheet at the same time. The best way to do this is to put your data sheet into a baggie and fold it up, and then put it in with your samples so that they just always stay together and they don't get separated. Okay, so once you get back to shore, you want to get those water bottles on ice right away. And then refer to that schedule and turn in your samples to the appropriate location. A lot of times it's a DEQ office. It might be a DNR office. So you just follow whatever that schedule tells you. And you want to get it in by noon. And the reason we say noon is because the afternoon they will be overnight shipping the samples to Lansing, where we process them. So want to make sure that everything gets in on time so your sample doesn't get missed. Now, if for whatever reason, I'm sorry, let me back up. If you have any issues with your sample turn-in date and you just can't make it work, like your schedule doesn't allow you to turn that sample in when we ask you, we just ask for either a phone call or an email so we can work out alternative ways of getting your sample. All right, never just turn your sample in outside of the office door and expect it to be fine. You know, that's how samples get ruined. You want to hand it to the person who's expecting it, and that's really the only way we want it done, unless you talk to us first. Why do samples get rejected sometimes? If you collect outside of that scheduled date, your sample might get rejected. We have that specific schedule for a reason, and we stick to it. Don't use a weird bottle. If you lose your bottles and you need new bottles, please let us know, because if you put your water sample in something strange, it's not guaranteed to be sterile, and we will reject those. And that happens once or twice a year, so please don't let that be you. If you go deliver to the wrong place or the wrong time, there's a chance that your sample might never reach us. So once again, just pay attention to that. And then if your bottle cracks because it got frozen and the water expanded, then those samples get rejected. So make sure that you leave that headroom so the water can expand and not crack the bottle. You can enter your data into the data exchange. And at the end of the season, you will get a graph, once again, mixed in with all the other data that you've collected that shows how your phosphorus is doing over time. Okay, you guys don't have to fill out an evaluation form. So I think that covers this presentation.
So we have 2 questions that came in. Why don't we just quickly answer those and then we can move on to the next module. All right, well, let's try out the phone lines here. It looks like we have a question from Joe Plunky. Joe, I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line so you can ask your question now. Joe, are you still there? Yeah. Make sure your phone's not on mute. Okay. Yes, go ahead, please.
No question. I don't know why the hand's up.
Okay. False alarm then. All right. I'll go ahead and put your phone back on mute then. All right. Our other question that came in was from Chuck Van Gordon. And Chuck asks, what if you work all week and there's a lot of boat traffic on weekends? Can you take the measurements at different times, meaning early morning or late afternoon?
Well, you could. You know your lake better than I do and what times it's calm and when it's not. You're really only hurting your data quality if you do it at a bad time. You may want to consider asking a neighbor or friend possibly to do the Secchi disk. So that would be my advice. Really, you know, if you're collecting under bad conditions, you're only hurting your own data.
Okay. And it looks like we have another hand raised from Lynn Fleming. Lynn, your line is unmuted, so go ahead with your question.
Yeah, that was a mistake on my computer here.
Oh, another false alarm.
Yeah,
all
I
right.
have to get used to how to use it.
No problem. All right, let me mute your line again. Okay, and then another question, what are bad conditions?
Bad conditions would be heavy wave action, if we're talking about Secchi in particular, anything that can churn up the water so that you're getting a lot of suspended solids. Because if you do that, then you're really probably measuring the amount of clay you have and not the amount of algae you have. So the calmer, the better.
Okay, I think that's it. So with that, why don't we move on to the next section, which is score the shore, right, Paul? Mm-hmm. All right. So this next presentation is going to be done by video. If you guys have any issues with hearing the audio as this plays, please send me a message and I'll see if I can correct it at our end. But fingers crossed this will work just perfectly. And here we go.
Shorelines are an important component of every lake. They are the primary habitat area for most of a lake's animals. Birds, amphibians, reptiles, insects, and fish all rely on the shallow water and the aquatic terrestrial vegetation along the edge to find food and a safe place to rear their young. Healthy shorelines help maintain water quality, limit erosion, and slow rain runoff. However, shorelines are threatened on most lakes where people live and recreate. Houses and everything associated with them often eliminate the important components of a healthy shoreline. Lawns, rocks, and seawalls remove optimal habitat locations. Foot traffic, docks, and the desire for an unobstructed view of the lake remove vegetation that stops erosion. The Score the Shore assessment is a standardized method that aids lake residents in finding problematic habitat areas on their lakes. To do this, a team of 3 to 4 people will troll around the edge of the lake and judge the health of the shoreline using a scoring form. The shoreline is broken into 1,000-foot sections that are scored individually. The first step in the Score the Shore process is to break your shoreline into the approximately 1,000-foot sections. The sections don't have to be exactly 1,000 feet, just close to it. You need to do this before you begin the survey. We recommend using an aerial map to first produce a rough sketch of where the 1,000-foot sections will fall. Then, cruise around the lake in your boat and pinpoint specific landmarks, like a house or a dock, that indicate the exact start and stop of each section. The second step is to print the data sheets. You only need one copy of the survey cover sheet, but you will need many copies of the survey data form. Each 1,000-foot section will require several of these data forms, depending on how many people make up your team. They are available at the website shown. The third step is to gather your equipment. Here is a list of what is needed or suggested for the assessment. Most of the use of this equipment is self-evident. One thing to highlight is the tally counter, or clicker. You will use these to count houses, docks, and woody debris, and it'll be a big time saver. To properly assess the lake, it needs to have plants or vegetative growth. Therefore, it is recommended to wait until at least mid-June before starting and finish before mid-September. Otherwise, the exact timing of when to conduct the assessment is up to you. The size of your lake will determine how long it will take to finish the assessment. On a small lake, the assessment may only take a couple of hours, but it could take several days on a large lake. Plan on each 1,000-foot section taking at least 30 minutes. As your team gets better at its job, this number will go down. Finally, you should repeat this survey occasionally. We recommend doing the survey every 3 to 5 years on your lake. Based on our experience working with teams and volunteers on the water, you'll find in the Score the Shore procedures that we include a recommended process for your team to follow while scoring the shoreline sections. This process tends to work efficiently for teams. It follows the sequence of items on the scoring form and allows you to get a good view of the shoreline features you need to assess. You may find a different process that works well for your team on your lake. Let's review this general recommended process now. An efficient Score the Shore team should consist of at least 3 people. One person whose primary responsibility is driving the boat, and 2 others focused on assessing the shoreline features. Navigate to your chosen starting point at the beginning of your first 1,000-foot shoreline section. Plan to make at least 3 passes back and forth in your boat along this 1,000-foot section. For the first pass, position the boat about 100 yards offshore. This will allow you a view where you can see most of the 1,000-foot section at once. You'll then make a second pass closer to shore, about 20 to 30 feet out. The final pass will be back out at about 100 yards from the shore. Every team member, except potentially the driver, should be provided with a stack of scoring forms, one for each 1,000-foot section, and will record answers to the questions. The driver can idle the boat while the team discusses answers to the various questions and reaches agreement. One person should record the final answers. This is the survey cover sheet. It includes general information about the survey. Record the lake name, county, and townships, as well as the lake sampling site or field ID number. Record the names of all the team members and the date of the survey. It's okay to conduct the survey over multiple days. Just record all the dates on this cover sheet. Lake level at the time of the survey can influence some of your observations. Indicate whether the lake level during the survey was average or normal, low or high. Some lakes have a legally mandated lake level that is managed by a dam. If your lake has a legal lake level, check yes on the cover sheet and indicate the measurement at the level gauge near the outlet at the time of the survey if possible. There is also space for you to comment on whether the lake level impacted the survey results. For example, if the water level is quite high during the survey, it may make it difficult to see certain shoreline features because they may be underwater. If possible, the survey should be conducted during normal lake level conditions. The bottom half of the survey cover sheet should be filled in when your survey is complete. Here you will record the total number of 1,000-foot shoreline sections that were surveyed on your lake. If the final section surveyed was substantially shorter than 1,000 feet, you can record the approximate length here. Note whether photographs were taken as part of the survey. Photos can be really helpful for comparing conditions over time and can help you look back and answer questions you may have about the survey. However, photographs are not required. Calculate the development density and overall shore score for your lake by following the instructions in the box. Development density around a lake and the overall shore score are often related. Now, let's take a look at the scoring form itself. Your report will include one of these scoring forms for each 1,000-foot section on your lake. At the top of the form, record the section number. This is very important. Also record the lake name, county, and date. While recording the lake name on every sheet may seem redundant, it's critical to include this information on every form for statewide record keeping. Then, record GPS coordinates or a landmark that indicates the starting point for this 1,000-foot shoreline section. Refrain from using people's full names, for example, John Smith's house, on the scoring forms, out of considerations for your neighbor's privacy. Copies of these forms will be stored by the MiCorps program forever. The scoring form is laid out with the expectation that your team will follow the 3-pass process we outlined earlier. Recall that you don't have to do the survey this way, but many teams have found that it works well. First, we'll review this entire scoring form. Next, we'll look at photographs and examples of the types of things you might see along the shoreline of your lake and examples of how to fill out this form. But first, back to the form. For Pass 1, you should keep your boat about 100 yards from shore. Cruise along the shoreline and count the number of homes and major buildings and the number of docks and boat lifts. When you reach the end of Pass 1, make sure that everyone on the team agrees where this shoreline section ends. Next, head back in the opposite direction, closer to shore for Pass 2. You should be 20 to 30 yards out, so you can see the shoreline features well. You'll be looking at the littoral zone features and shoreline erosion. The littoral zone is the underwater area close to shore. The handy diagram in the upper right corner of the sheet will help you remember this. First question, what percentage of the 1,000-foot section exhibits emergent or floating vegetation? Emergent vegetation are aquatic plants that stick up out of the water. This would include reeds and pickerel weed. Floating vegetation typically is water lilies. Your options include none, less than 10% of the total 1,000-foot section, 10 to 25%, 25 to 75%, or more than 75%. Notice that after each choice is a number in parentheses. This is the number of points the section earns for each option. No need to worry about those points now. You'll add them up later, back on shore. The next question asks you to estimate how much of the shoreline exhibits submerged vegetation. Those would be underwater plants, like coontail and milfoil. If the water isn't clear enough for you to make this estimate, simply check Unable to See. The next question asks you if aquatic plant management is evident or known. That is, can you see or do you know that plants have been sprayed, harvested, or otherwise removed along this 1,000-foot section? If not, choose No. Otherwise, select Minor if there's some weed management around docks and swim areas, or Major if practically all the plant life in the lake near shore has been treated or removed. Next, estimate the amount of downed trees or other woody debris, like branches or logs, along this 1,000-foot section. Your choices are none, a few, that is 1 to 5 trees or branches, several, or many. Your last observation during this second pass, close to shore, is to estimate how much erosion you observe along this 1,000-foot section. None, minor, moderate, or severe. We recognize this is a judgment call on your part, but that's what we're looking for, your team's opinion about the extent of erosion in this section. For Pass 3, take the boat back out to about 100 yards from shore for the final observations. First, estimate the percentage of maintained lawn, beach, and impervious surface along the 1,000-foot section. Don't count naturally sandy shoreline as maintained beach. Impervious surface refers to areas where rainwater can't soak in, pavement or pavers without space between them. What percentage of the 1,000-foot section is unmowed vegetation? That's vegetation other than lawn, such as brush, trees, or weedy overgrowth. Next, about how deep does that unmowed vegetation extend back from the water's edge? Less than 10 feet? 10 to 40 feet back from shore? More? The final section refers to erosion control practices that you see along the shoreline. Are people doing things to stop erosion? The categories include vertical artificial, which includes any kind of vertical structure that people have installed, including metal seawalls or rock walls. Sloped artificial includes sloped structures or materials placed on the shoreline. Common examples include concrete or rocks. Finally, is there any bioengineering evidence? This includes use of natural materials to stop erosion, like bundles of branches or core logs, which are long bundles of coconut fibers. Once your team has answered these questions, it is time to record the GPS coordinates or landmark at the end of the section. Again, don't take time to add up scores now. That can be done when you're back on shore. On the back of each section's data sheet, you'll find space for scoring and comments. This math scales all of your scores to a 0 to 100 point range to aid in their interpretation. Many lakes may be turbid enough or have bad lighting conditions, so you can't see the submerged vegetation. If that is the case for your lake, use the alternative equation shown. This equation takes submerged vegetation out of the final score altogether. If you have comments or concerns about this section of shoreline or about the survey itself, you can include them in the space provided here. Beginning back at the top of the data form, we'll now look at photographic examples of each feature you'll be looking for. Remember, the assessment is done on 1,000-foot sections as a whole, not lot by lot. You'll see that most of the upcoming photos show single lots, but that's just for illustration purposes. We recommend beginning pass 1 about 100 yards from shore to count homes and major buildings and docks. During this pass, you can also make sure that everyone on the survey team agrees where the section begins and ends. When you count the number of docks and boat lifts in your 1,000-foot section, a dock with an attached boat lift, like this one, just counts as 1. Now, make a second pass along the section closer to shore, as conditions allow for safe navigation. This may be about 20 to 30 yards from shore. This photograph shows emergent and floating vegetation. The reeds closer to the shoreline are emergent plants. They grow up out of the water. The water lilies in the foreground are floating vegetation. Here's another example of a littoral area in the lake that has both floating and emergent vegetation. This photo shows floating algae on the surface of a lake. This floating algae can be counted as floating vegetation. Here's an example of submerged vegetation. Submerged vegetation may come close to the surface. Small flowers or other reproductive structures may break the surface, but the rest is underwater and counts as submerged vegetation. Submerged vegetation may also be far beneath the surface, growing low against the lake bottom. Now, let's look at evidence of aquatic plant management. A single bubbler like this is minor aquatic plant management. The constant disturbance by bubbles prevents floating plants and other vegetation from taking root in a small area. Mechanical harvesting across an entire section or much of it would be considered major management activity. Weed roller use in a few places along a section could be considered minor, but if everyone's doing it, leading to nearly continuous removal of aquatic vegetation, then you can call it major. What should you count as downed trees and woody debris? Partially or fully submerged wood counts. If the lake is unusually low during the survey, feel free to count wood that is currently exposed but would normally be at least partially submerged. Concentrate your counting on pieces 3 inches or larger in diameter. Don't worry about counting the twigs. This fallen tree is only partially in the water, but it counts if it's in the water at all. Wood near the lakeshore can provide valuable cover for fish and other wildlife. Here's another example of wood in the water. These are definitely big enough to count. Here's another interesting example. Some wood you encounter may have been placed on purpose to control erosion. If that's the case, you can count it here, but we'll also be able to consider it when you're assessing erosion control later on in the data form. Now, let's look at evidence of erosion. This is an example of a small area of erosion. Include erosion that is clearly the result of human activity, as well as erosion that may be caused by forces of nature, like wind, waves, or ice. This situation is commonly seen. There is erosion all along this stretch of lakeshore. It's probably not severe, that is, the hillside isn't about to fall in, but likely moderate, since it is happening along a long stretch, and it appears that the property owner is trying to stop it by placing some rocks along the shore. Here is another example of moderate erosion. The tree isn't falling into the lake yet, and erosion is likely slow and gradual. However, if you're familiar with this property and happen to know that in the spring there was no erosion at all, you would be justified in calling this severe erosion because you know it's happening rapidly. Here's another example of moderate erosion. The sloped lawn shows clear evidence of erosion, likely because they are trying to maintain lawn on a steep slope. But there are no major cave-ins or slumps. This hill slope is actively eroding. For this small stretch, erosion seems severe. This property seems to have no vegetation on the slope and has the potential for serious erosion. Consider approaching nearer to take a closer look. Is there evidence of active erosion? Should a beach area be counted as erosion? Only if there are active signs of the sand being lost to the lake. If your lake is naturally sandy, sand beaches may be a natural feature and should not be counted as erosion. Now, let's head back out further from shore, like 100 yards out, for our final pass. You'll now assess the riparian zone, that land near the shore, and erosion control practices. Maintained lawn refers to turf grass or other vegetation that is regularly mowed for use or appearance as lawn. In this example, we see maintained lawn as well as a small impervious walkway. Remember, impervious means water cannot penetrate. For this assessment, you will judge the percentage of the section length that is lawn, artificial beach, and impervious all together. Here's an interesting example where you can clearly see maintained lawn and a parking lot, which is impervious surface, along the shoreline. This patio is another example of impervious surface. The gravel and mulch around it is not impervious. Water can soak through, but the pavers create a section of impervious surface. This patio is entirely impervious. This lot exhibits maintained lawn and an artificial beach. We know it is an artificial beach because the shoreline of this lake is not naturally sandy. The sand is likely brought in by the homeowner for a small swimming area. This lot includes an artificial beach and artificial erosion control. Now we're looking at some good stuff, unmowed vegetation. Look at two characteristics. First, what percentage of the 1,000-foot section has unmowed vegetation? And that can include any vegetation, tall grasses, wildflowers, weeds, shrubs, and trees. Second, on average, how deep is that belt of unmowed vegetation? That is, how far does it stretch back from the water's edge? This one appears to stretch back less than 10 feet. There appears to be some rock that has been placed at the base of this unmowed vegetation belt. That's okay. We can comment on that under the shoreline erosion control practices section. This vegetation should still be counted under unmowed vegetation. Here's another unmowed vegetation belt. It's not very deep, but it's there. This lot includes gravel, rock, and beds of unmowed vegetation. You can consider the entire lot to have a belt of unmowed vegetation, even though there is some exposed gravel. The depth of the unmowed vegetation belt on this lot is fairly deep. It appears to be more than 10 feet, but probably less than 40 feet. This lot is heavily wooded. If vegetation is growing densely enough that you can't see through it, you can safely say that it is greater than 40 foot deep. This section of shoreline exhibits a couple of different depths of unmowed vegetation. On your left-hand side, the unmowed vegetation starts as shrubby growth along the shoreline and becomes forest further back. It's definitely more than 40 feet deep. On your right-hand side, there's just a narrow strip of unmowed vegetation behind the dock before the lawn. This is easily less than 10 feet. Now, let's look at some shoreline erosion control practices, starting with artificial erosion control, like steel and rock. Vertical artificial practices include structures like metal seawalls, vertical boulders, and rock walls. This picture shows a vertical seawall. Here is another example of a long metal seawall. This vertical seawall is made from concrete. Large boulders and vertical walls of rock are also considered vertical artificial structures. Here we have a vertical boulder wall in front of a concrete seawall. Structure like this one should also be considered vertical. Even though there is some slope to the boulders in front of the seawall, it doesn't pass what we call the turtle test. We like to reference the turtle test for determining whether erosion control structure is vertical or sloped. If a turtle in the lake has no chance of making it up onto dry land, it's probably vertical. What do you think of this type of erosion control? Even though it's fairly low, it still should be considered vertical. Think of that little turtle. Now, let's look at some examples of sloped artificial erosion control practices. This can include concrete in smooth or broken pieces and riprap or smaller rocks. A turtle might struggle here too, but at least it has a chance when it comes to sloped artificial control practices. Here's an example of extensive sloped artificial erosion control created from concrete block. Sloped riprap is quite common along many lake shorelines. It passes the turtle test. Here you can see a lot lined with sloped rock. Their neighbor has installed a vertical steel seawall. Even a small amount of rock or riprap should be considered when you estimate the overall percentage of sloped artificial erosion control in the 1,000-foot section you are working on. And be sure to count it even if there is unmowed vegetation growing on top of it or behind it. Is this an example of sloped or vertical artificial erosion control? At the foot of the slope, where it reaches the water, it is sloped rock or riprap. There are vertical rock walls that create terraces upland of the riprap. Try the turtle test. The turtle should be able to make it to dry land. Call it sloped. Even though there are rocks or riprap piled up against the seawall in this example, it should be counted as vertical seawall. What about this example? In this case, you may be able to count it as sloped. At least in the more distant part of this picture, our turtle may be able to make the transition. Remember, just use your best judgment on these categories. Work with your team to agree upon how to record what you observe. Finally, let's look at some examples of bioengineering or soft engineering erosion control. What you see here are core logs, long bundles of coconut or other natural fibers designed to stop erosion. Note that while these areas don't get a positive score on the data form, like a natural shoreline would, the score is less negative than artificial structures, because although erosion is being managed, it is being dealt with in a way that eventually, with proper maintenance, will be indistinguishable from natural shoreline. The shoreline will be recovered at that point. On a related note, if you know of an area where bioengineering was installed years ago, and now most people wouldn't be able to tell that it ever happened, that is, it looks natural now, then that shoreline area should be considered natural and not included in your percentage of shoreline with evident bioengineering. Here's a closer look at core logs in action. Note the vegetation planted between the logs. The roots of those plants will eventually take over the job of erosion control. Core logs are sometimes installed along great lengths of shoreline. Stumps and bundles of brush or branches are also used for bioengineered erosion control. Remember this picture from the woody debris section? You can also include this stretch in your assessment of the extent of bioengineering erosion control in this section. What about stuff like this? You can definitely see some artificial erosion control going on here, and it looks like it would pass the turtle test. We'll call it sloped artificial. One more example. What do you see here? From this angle, it looks like our turtle would have a tough time making it over this wood material. If that's the case, it doesn't pass the turtle test, and you can call it vertical artificial. Now for some last bits of advice. Photographs can be immensely useful for documenting your observations. Here are some helpful rules for ensuring that your photos will be useful for you. First, take lots of pictures. Discard any that are blurry or out of focus. And be sure to incorporate a method for recording the location where each photo was taken. This can be done in a number of ways, such as recording the photo number on your data sheet for that section, or taking a picture of the section number, perhaps written on a piece of paper or dry erase board, before you begin photographing that section of shoreline. Your Score the Shore report should be submitted to MiCorps by the October 30 annual deadline. The Score the Shore procedures include the details of where to send your complete report, which should include a completed survey cover sheet, a set of all data forms. There should be one for each 1,000-foot section on your lake, a map of your lake showing the locations of each section, and finally, any photographs you'd like to submit. Be sure to make a copy for your records before submitting your report to MiCorps. So what good is all this information anyway? The results from this survey are not regulatory and not intended to be as enforcement for what people can or can't do on their property. However, the assessment is a valuable educational tool. You can share your results with neighbors and give tips on how lake residents can help improve scores. We recommend newsletter articles, talks at neighborhood and association meetings, and friendly conversations. It's also valuable if you're able to repeat the survey. You may see areas where your lake has improved or gotten worse over time. Thanks for watching. We hope that this video accomplished our goal of instructing you on how to conduct a Score the Shore assessment in the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program.
Okay, that's it for the Score the Shore video. Are there any questions before we move on to our next training session? If not, do you want to take like a 3-minute break, Paul, or just push on forward?
Let's keep going because this will be long.
Okay. All right, well, if you guys come up with any questions in the meantime, feel free to type them in and we'll come back to it at the very end.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Make sure that everything is popping up on screen here, and then I will get going.
Sorry, everyone, we're having some technical difficulties here.
Okay, so in case you just came on, my name is Paul Steen, and I work with the Huron River Watershed Council as one of the staff members who runs the CLMP with the DEQ. And this presentation is about chlorophyll A. It's one of the parameters that we measure along with these others listed here that give a sense of the underlying food web of your lake. And we'll talk specifically at the end of this presentation, what are the consequences of your the levels of your trophic state indicators. But we're going to start off by talking about chlorophyll and how to measure it.
You know what, Paul, if I could just stop you for a moment. We're seeing something weird on the presentation. It looks okay in the room here, but let me just try something. Okay, there we go.
Everything coming through?
Yeah.
All right, thanks. So I'm going to talk about what chlorophyll is, the schedule for sampling. There's actually 2 parts to the monitoring. There's a water collection phase, and then there's a filtering phase. So I'll talk about both of those, and then more information about what does a trophic state indicator mean, and follow it up with just some look at some graphs of what people have found in the past. So what is chlorophyll A? Chlorophyll A is actually the photosynthetic pigment that is found in all green plants. That includes leaves, that includes grass, that includes algae. Chlorophyll is an important indicator because it directly represents the amount of algae in a lake. Lakes that produce lots of algae are higher in nutrients, which is good for the fish and the other aquatic life. But as we all know, if levels of nutrients get too high, then the lake can be in danger of algae blooms and fish kills, and that's not so good. So it's a lot of what we are doing in this program is trying to get a sense of the degree in which your lake may be in danger of having these algae blooms and fish kills. I had a vacuum cleaner running in the background, which is now done. So why chlorophyll A? What are we talking about when we say chlorophyll A? So actually there are several different types of chlorophyll. There's a chlorophyll A, a B, a C, and a D, which are found in different types of algae. And I just bring up this carbon molecule here so you can see like there's different chains that get added to make the chlorophyll from one type to another type. But the takeaway here is that chlorophyll A is what we monitor in this program, and it's the most common type of chlorophyll that's found in the Midwestern region. Sampling schedule. This will look familiar to you because it's formatted very similar to the way that the summer phosphorus schedule is formatted. Depending on your county, it controls when you do your sampling. And so that has the sampling dates there in the third column, and then when you're turning your samples in the fourth column. Now you'll see samples 1, 2, 3, and 4. They always fall between the 10th and the 20th of those particular months. No matter where you are in the state, that will be true. So you'll always be trying to get your sample in that 10-day period. Sample 5 is where we have differences in location. And we did this so that it would line up more conveniently with your late summer phosphorus sample. So you'll end up taking your late summer phosphorus and your 5th chlorophyll sample at the same time. And so that's why you get a weird date on that 5th sample. There's 2 turn-ins for chlorophyll. The first turn-in is actually the same day that you will be turning in your spring phosphorus sample. So you'll turn them in at the same time, assuming you're enrolled in both parameters. And then the next turn-in date is the same time you turn in your summer phosphorus sample. So the reason we do have 2 turn-ins like this is it reduces congestion at the lab so that we can start getting things processed through the summer, and then once that's done, they'll have a new batch coming in. So it just makes having 2 turn-ins can be inconvenient for you having to turn it in twice, but the lab would not be happy with us if we dumped all our thousands of samples on them at the same time. So doing it twice is a good way to maintain goodwill and make sure the program keeps moving. Your chlorophyll data form will look like this. You'll actually have 2 data forms because you have 2 turn-ins, and you turn in the data form when you turn in your samples. So your first data form will have information for May and June, and then your second data form will have information for July, August, September. And it's a lot of the same fields that you've been seeing so far. The one thing that might be a little, well, there's a couple things that might be a little strange to you here. There's a composite sample depth line. We're going to talk about what that is in just a second. And then there's this thing that says filtering sample If 50 cc's could not be filtered for the sample, indicate the amount filtered. So those are the two things that are kind of specific to chlorophyll. And as we go through the presentation, you'll see how they get filled out. Just like with Secchi, we need a certain number of samples to know that we have a good overall look at your lake through the entire summer growing season. The algae populations change over time. For chlorophyll, we absolutely need 4 samples at the minimum, and it'd be great if you can get 5 samples. So 4 is the absolute minimum that we need to properly characterize your chlorophyll A in your lake through the summer. And if you don't get those 4 samples, then once again, you don't get the statistics, and it doesn't get added onto your long-term trend, which is really what we're trying to develop here, is understand what's happening long-term on your lakes. I guess I mentioned this way back in the beginning when we first started talking, there's a quick monitoring reference procedures. For chlorophyll, I think more important than any other parameter, it's really important that you get this quick reference procedures document off of our MiCorps webpage. There's a lot of picky details in what we're about to cover, so having that quick reference sheet right next to you as you go through things, it will be really important, especially since you're not watching us live. So if you're watching us live, a lot of the hand motions and things that we do might stick with you a little bit better than just seeing it on a computer. So, so just take your time with this quick reference sheet and follow it carefully. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I will say that if you registered for chlorophyll, you should have gotten by now your equipment in the mail, which will include a whole variety of things that you'll see get used throughout this presentation. So it should have arrived by now. Your first sample could start in 9 days, actually. If it's not your first year, but you've done this before, then all you really need to do is get a resupply kit. There's a few things that get used up, so you have to reorder them every year. Like you always need new filters and you always need new vials. So for a lesser cost, if you've been in the program for 2 or more years, you just buy one of these. There's some things that you need to provide. PFDs, anchors, just like what you would use for the other parameters. That pencil or the indelible ink pen, a Sharpie. You never use a ballpoint pen. You will need your own line. The line will get attached to the chlorophyll sampler, and you'll need to have it marked in ½ feet. So that's something that we don't provide that you'll need to provide for yourself. So a line, it could be like an anchor line, for example, but it would be used with the sampler. And just like with phosphorus, you're going to want a freezer ice pack in the container to put it in. Okay, let's talk about step 1 here of how to take the measurement. This is what your sampler looks like. This thing can be fully disassembled. You can unscrew that cap and pop out a rubber stopper that has 2 glass tubes in it. Once you do that, then you can loosen up that retaining chain, and that whole amber bottle can come right out of this contraption. I'm just telling you that because you'll need to rinse this bottle before you start, which means you have to disassemble the whole thing. And also, you want to dry this out after you're done, or it will rust through. So you'll have to get used to assembling and reassembling this contraption. It's pretty simple, really. Okay, so you head out onto the lake. You have all your equipment with. I should mention that your procedures should break down your water collection equipment and your filtering equipment, you don't need to bring your filtering equipment onto the boat. That will actually be done inside, usually in a kitchen or a laundry room or something with a sink. So you have an indoor and an outdoor component, and obviously you only need to bring the outdoor equipment when you go outside. Okay, so let's say we are out on the lake. We are at our sample point. You can start filling out data sheets. Here it is again, just filled out version of what we already looked at. So I'll just keep going. You've seen this a couple times now too. The back side of the data sheet is the same options that we've seen already. Now, the interesting thing about chlorophyll is actually you start off by taking a Secchi disc measurement. So chances are you're going to be doing this anyway because you'll be registered for Secchi if you're doing chlorophyll. So you get that Secchi disc measurement. And the Secchi disc measurement enables you to calculate what we call the composite sample depth. And all that really is you take the Secchi disc measurement and you multiply it by 2. All right, and so that's what gets filled in on your data sheet where it says composite sample depth. What is all this composite sample depth stuff? Well, basically what's going on in your lake is that the light can penetrate through the water column to about twice the depth of how far down you can actually see with your own eyes. So it's twice the Secchi depth that is the zone in which you are getting algae growth. So when we do a sample, you actually want to drop our composite sampler to twice the Secchi depth so that it collects water throughout this entire range. So that's kind of the reason why we're measuring Secchi, is because we need to know how far the light can penetrate. Okay, so having done the Secchi and then doubled it to get our sampling depth, you can disassemble your contraption, rinse it out a couple of times with lake water. Remember, there are weights in the bottom of your sampler. So inevitably, a couple times a year, someone will, right at this step, knock over their entire sampler into the water, and it will sink and they'll lose it. So don't let that be you. You know, wisely don't do what you see in this picture, but keep that sampler on the ground so there's no chance of falling over. Even if it's attached to a rope, those weights can still fall out. Okay, so having reassembled it, we are going to lower it to twice the Secchi depth. Okay, so a couple hints here to make this go more easily. Take a clothespin and attach the clothespin to your line at that depth, twice the Secchi depth. Then you take your whole line and just throw it into the water so it's not, so when it starts dropping, it's not wrapping around stuff on your boat or around your legs. Because what we're trying to do is have a nice, smooth drop down into the water. So you just let this thing fall until that clothespin is right at the surface and the line is tight. And that way you know that it has gone down to its furthest depth. Now, a question that always comes up is, what if my lake isn't deep enough and I can't actually double the Secchi depth like I'm talking about? Well, in that case, you just go as deep as you can. So let's say your lake is only 20 feet deep and your Secchi is 15 feet. Normally, you would want to put your chlorophyll sampler down 30 feet. But obviously, you can't do that in your lake. So what you do is you go probably about to depth 19 or so. You don't want to actually hit the bottom with your sampler, but so you have to watch it maybe a little more carefully. But you go right down to the very bottom without touching, And that's what you end up writing on your data sheet. So that's the exception if you have a shallow lake. Okay, so you let that go. As soon as your rope gets tight, you can start pulling the composite sampler back up to the surface. And as you do this, water is going in through these rubber tubes that are in the cap, and air is getting released at the same time. There's actually 2 rubber tubes, one for air and one for water. So when you get it up out of the water, take it apart again and take a look. Our goal is to have this bottle be filled up 2/3 to 3/4 full. We don't want it completely full, and the reason we don't want it completely full is because then you don't know at what point it actually did get filled up. Did it get filled up on the way down? Did it get filled up while you were pulling it up? You just don't know. And since our goal is to collect water over the entire depth, the only way to be sure that you're doing that is it can't be full. It can't be empty either because you need enough water to actually do the next steps. So what you do is if you pull it up and it's full, you just dump the whole thing and start over. Change up how fast you pull the chlorophyll sampler up, and maybe you need to pull it up faster. So you kind of play around with that and try to figure out the proper speed to pull up the sampler so that you end up with a bottle that is not full, but full enough to fill up both of your rectangular amber bottles. Okay, you'll have 2 of these bottles and you want to fill up both of them. You can fill them both up with a single pull. You don't have to repeat the whole process to fill up your second bottle. Okay, and once you fill up these 2 rectangular amber bottles, you take the magnesium carbonate, you shake it really good, like really vigorously because this stuff really settles out, and add 5 drops of that to each bottle. And what that is doing is it's stabilizing the sample and helping the chlorophyll cells not break apart and release their chlorophyll all over the place. So you want to have, basically you want to have cells of algae that are not breaking apart but are remaining steady and whole. So get your 5 drops in and then put it on cold storage. Once again, we're slowing biological activity down because we want it to be the same as what we just pulled out of the lake. Okay, so we've gotten to the second part, which is filtering the water sample. This is really, really hard to show with still images. So what we have done is created a video that walks through the filtering process. So we're going to watch that. And then once that's done, we'll continue with the PowerPoint part.
The best place to filter a chlorophyll sample is indoors, by a sink, and out of direct sunlight. Make sure you have all of the equipment listed. Ready to go? First, unscrew and open the filter holder. Use tweezers to pick up and move the filter. Never use your fingers. The filter is a glossy and opaque white circle. Be sure not to use the filter separators, which are translucent and look more like tissue paper. Center the filter on the screen and place the O-ring on top of the filter. Screw the filter holder back together until it is moderately tight and place it to the side for the moment. Grab the syringe and the small piece of clear plastic tubing. You can push the tubing onto the syringe. It doesn't fit perfectly, but it will not slip off if you work at it. Swirl or invert one of the amber bottles to mix. Rinse the syringe by drawing up sample water until the syringe is full, and then empty it. Then fill it up to the 60 milliliters. With the syringe pointing up, tap it to force air bubbles to the top. Push the syringe plunger until the end of the plunger is lined up with the 50 milliliter mark. Attach the filter holder to the syringe. Like the tubing, it won't snap into place, but you can get it to fit snugly. Slowly push the chlorophyll sample through the filter holder and adjust your pressure to achieve a rapid drop rate. Pushing too hard may rip the filter, so avoid excessive pressure. As you push the plunger, make sure that no water is leaking out the side of the filter holder. If your sample has a lot of algae or other particles in it, it may become too difficult to push the full 50 milliliters of sample through the filter. In these situations, stop pushing and note how much water you were able to filter by reading the side of the syringe. There is a place on the data sheet for you to record this information. After filtering the water, separate the filter holder from the syringe and unscrew it. Using a safety pin and tweezers, fold the filter in quarters with the algae on the inside. The filter will probably stick a bit to the filter holder, and it requires a steady hand and some practice to do this job smoothly. Remember, never touch the filter with your fingers. Put the folded filter into a sample vial and cap it. Place a filled out sample label onto the vial lengthwise so that none of the label is wrapped upon itself. Let's take a look at what a correctly filled out sample label looks like. You need to use a fine-tipped, permanent black marker to fill out the sample labels. In addition to the basic lake information, write CA in the parameter code box and write MgCO3, which stands for magnesium carbonate, into chemicals added. Remember, you added magnesium carbonate in an earlier step. On the label for your second sample, write REP next to the lake name. This is short for replicate. You now have one sample complete. Congratulations! Now you get to do it all over again with your second sample bottle. Once both samples are complete, wrap the vials completely with aluminum foil to keep all light out. This foil wrapping step is critical. Unwrapped samples cannot be accepted for laboratory analysis. Write your lake's name and the sample month on the foil packet. The samples go into a Ziploc bag with your lake name, county, and field ID number. Fold the data sheet, place it into a separate Ziploc bag so it stays dry, and place it in the bag with your samples. Storing your data sheet with the samples is a good way to make sure the paperwork never gets lost. And then everything goes into the freezer until it is time to turn it in. Each lake is assigned to a sample drop-off location.
Okay, so as you can see, lots of steps. That's why I recommend you just have the procedures right there with you. You are given maybe 1 or 2 extra filters. Actually 1. You're given 1 extra filter. So it gives you a chance to practice this before you do it for real, if it's your first time. If you end up needing more filters, please get in touch with us and ask for them. You know, it's not easy, and it does take a little bit of practice. Okay, I have some extra slides in here because in case videos don't work, you should always have slides. So I'll skip ahead through these still photos. Okay, to get to this, and there's some important things to highlight on this slide. We tend to have a higher rejection rate of samples with chlorophyll than we do with phosphorus, just because more things can go wrong. So here are some of the main reasons things go wrong. People collect it outside of that date that's given on the schedule, so please make sure you skip to that or stick to that schedule. I'm going to save that second bullet and come back to it. That third bullet, samples not wrapped in foil. Please wrap your samples in foil. You want it 100% covered so no light is penetrating and getting through. Obviously, algae could continue to grow if it has light and water, so you want to cut off all light so nothing else is growing after you take it and go through this whole process. And then once again, if you're not turning in at the right time or the right place, that can cause problems and may end up in your sample getting rejected. It could get lost more easily. So if you have any issues following the turn-in schedule, you have to contact us ahead of time and talk about how we can get those. Okay, so now the second bullet on here, this is by far the most commonly made mistake. When you get your filters, they come in these little envelopes. In the envelope, there are actually 2 small circles, one of which is called the cover slip, and one of them is the actual filter disc. The cover slip, which is junk, and you can just throw it away, it looks like tissue paper. It's actually like this plasticky piece of paper, and it doesn't have any filtering capabilities whatsoever. You actually can, if you try using it, you'll end up having a really hard time pushing your water sample through it. But somehow people manage to do it, to use it and then send it in. But that is an automatic rejection. So what you want to use is the actual filter paper. That is a piece of white, opaque paper. You cannot see through it. It doesn't let light pass at all. That's what you want. You do not want the tissue paper translucent circle. That gets thrown away. So any questions with that? It's a little easier to show you in person because then I can actually show you the difference. But any questions on that, please call or email. Make sure you get it right before you proceed. Okay, there we go. So that's the process for collecting chlorophyll. So it's just a few words about what all this means. Once again, at the end of the year, well, probably more like the beginning of the next year, you get a report. that gives your information, gives graphs, what your long-term trend on your lake, how things are changing. And we also give numbers called the Trophic Status Index. That's in the lower right here. You see Corey Lake, for example, in 2014 had a Trophic Status Index of 35. Okay, now what does that mean? And I have a couple slides talking about these numbers because they're actually a very handy way to understand what is happening in a lake. So for our 3 parameters that we've talked about today, the average Secchi depth, the summer phosphorus, and the chlorophyll, together they can be used to give a sense of the amount of nutrient growth, or the algae growth and nutrients in your lake. The problem with these 3 measurements is that they're all on different scales. Secchi depth is in feet, and it usually ranges between like 0 and 50, while phosphorus is in parts per billion, and it usually ranges from 3 to 200. And median chlorophyll ranges from about 1 to 50, and that's also parts per billion. So you can see that they're just much different measurements from each other. But by putting them through these equations, we can produce a number out on the other side where all of these are actually comparable. What we're doing here is we're scaling all of these parameters into the same scale. Then they can be compared against each other. So what I do is I take those scaled numbers called the Trophic Status Index, and I average them together, and that gives you an average Trophic Status Index that's using all 3 of your results here. And here's a little thermometer I like to use that shows how the Trophic Status Index changes. The numbers up top refer to the actual real life measurements that you're making, while the thing that looks like a thermometer, that's that Trophic Status Index. So if your lake has for example, has a Trophic Status Index of 45, that means your lake is mesotrophic. And if you follow that 45 straight up, it means your Secchi is, it's probably about 9 feet. Means your phosphorus is about 15, and your chlorophyll is about 4. And that particular combination, means you have a mesotrophic lake. So lakes get ranked according to these trophic categories. An oligotrophic lake means really low nutrients. It means high transparency, low chlorophyll. A eutrophic lake is a lake that is higher in nutrients. It means there's more food for the biota, the fish and the turtles and the amphibians. There's more food available, but it also means you're closer to getting into that hypereutrophic category, that's the danger zone of nutrients that are so high that they can cause algae blooms and eventually fish kills. So let's just see an example here. Baseline Lake is a lake pretty close to my house, and it's changed considerably over the years. In 1977, this is just Secchi for 1977 actually, they were right on that borderline between the medium and high. And as the years progressed, this lake put in a sewer system, which took a lot of nutrients out of the lake. They actually were infested with zebra mussels, which greatly increased the transparency. And you can see over time they moved on that scale from near eutrophic, and now they are near oligotrophic. So this Trophic Status Index that we use is just a very convenient way of understanding where on this continuum your lake falls. across the state, well, to be more accurate, I should say, across the state for lakes that are enrolled in this program, this is what we see. Fully half of our lakes are in that mesotrophic category. 38% are in that low nutrient oligotrophic category, and then 12% of our lakes are in that eutrophic category. And it's not shown on here, but we usually get about 0.5% or so of hypereutrophic lakes, lakes in the highest category. 1 or 2 lakes a year maybe have that. So it's just kind of an interesting way to compare what you have to what the other lakes are around you. Okay, so that is it for the chlorophyll presentation, and we can take any questions.
We actually don't have any questions, so we'll
We can wait.
give folks a couple minutes to...
Wait a couple minutes to type those out.
Yeah, and while you're thinking, I did make a note here. Here's our contact information for both Paul and for me. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email us or call us. And I also made a note here where there are these training videos that you saw today, as well as others, are available on the program website at that the address listed there. So please feel free to check out those training materials and others that are available from the program website. One last point, tomorrow you will probably be receiving from me a request by email to fill out a very short follow-up survey to help give us some feedback on this evening's webinar so that we can figure out how to make it better for future years. We do ask that you please complete that. We look forward to hearing what you thought. All right, last chance for questions. All right, I think, Paul, you just did such a great job.
I guess so.
Have any questions?
You got my email there, so drop me emails if anything comes up. And thanks for participating and listening along tonight.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Take care.